Hey you guys, it's Peter and welcome to my channel, Peter Watches TV, where I cover all the TV shows over here. I cover all the reality TV shows, all the trending shows on any of the streaming apps, and all the true crime shows that are coming out. And I will also be covering some of the past true crime shows that have come out. And today I want to talk about the new true crime documentary that just came out on Peacock that is called Face to Face, the Scott Peterson story. I want to talk about this because I watched them back-to-back 2 nights in a row. The first night I watched on Netflix, American Murder, the Laci Peterson story. And then I made my video about that over here. And then that night I watched the Scott Peterson telling his side of the story in the show Face to Face. And they're very, very different documentaries talking about the same story. In Face to Face on Peacock, Scott Peterson is actually interviewed. He hasn't done an interview in, I think it's like 20 years. He hasn't done an interview at all, any kind of media interviews. And so he finally opens up and is interviewed and tells his side of the story in this documentary through 15-minute interviews that this documentarian, who is highly biased, she does through jail video visits with him. So I watched it last night, and I wanted to turn around and do my coverage of that today. Now, I have extensive notes on this. The entire time I watched the show, I was taking notes on this. So let me kind of explain my background history of my experience with the Scott Peterson, the Laci Peterson situation. This was not, so for those of you that don't know, I have a true crime book club that I run with my friend Mel. Hey Mel, how are you? It's linked below if you want to join the true crime book club. Every month we pick a book to read over there. My interest in true crime started years and years and years ago. I can remember my grandma when I was growing up, my mom's mom, she would read literally those dime store true crime pulp, books that you would get at the grocery store. And she would read all the magazines and stuff like that. My grandfather, my dad's dad, was a homicide detective in Allen County, Indiana, and actually solved the first murder case in Allen County. And I just found out recently, a couple years ago, that his story was on the front of True Crime magazine in the 50s or something like that, which is kind of cool. But I've always kind of had an interest in true crime, but it kind of went up and down. I would read some and then I would stop for a couple of years and I would read some. Several years ago, I read Michelle McNamara's book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, One Woman's Obsessive Search for the Golden State Killer. And the way that she approached that case by interweaving her personal story with the story of the victims in the hunt for the Golden State Killer was so intriguing to me, and it was a new way of telling true crime. And I also love to watch true crime documentaries that it kind of reinvigorated my interest in true crime again. But through the years, I have to say, I am more interested in the smaller cases. I always have been. I've said that, I've always been interested in the small cases that happen in a town that nobody knows of in the middle of the Midwest. Those are the true crime cases, the missing people cases, that I am the most interested in. The big cases like Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac Killer, things like that, those are not cases that I typically follow. In fact, I just did a video over here recently about the Natalee Holloway case because a new documentary had come out about that. I never followed the Natalee Holloway case when it was going on. I would watch some of the Nancy Grace, episodes covering it with my friend Tanya, but I didn't watch it. I didn't cover it at that time. And also with the Laci Peterson case, it was another case that I didn't follow at that time. It's the Jodi Arias case I didn't cover at that time, either. A lot of the things that I know of these cases, we read about the Zodiac Killer and we read about, John Wayne Gacy and things like that. People that I knew about, but that were big cases, but I didn't know really much more about them until I read about them. I mean, there were certain, serial killers and things like that that I was always interested, like Eileen Wuornos, but that was because I watched the documentary series, The Life and Death of a Serial Killer, about Eileen Wuornos, and I became very intrigued with Eileen Wuornos as a person. I can remember watching Paradise Lost about the West of Memphis 3, and I watched all 3 parts of that series, and I thought it was fantastically done, and became very, very interested in them because as people, I didn't think that they were guilty of what had happened when you watch the documentary series. So a lot of my attraction to true crime is really about the people that are involved, whether it's the victims or the people that are involved in the case, and whatever their stories. That's mostly what is interesting to me, and typically it's the story of the victims, in all honesty, and how that's told. So a lot of the bigger cases, I don't really know that much about. I'm not really that interested in, like the smaller cases, I can tell you a lot about. I mean, I listened to the whole podcast, John Brown's Body, and then I watched the episode that was on Under the Friday Night Lights. I mean, the smaller cases, the Baumeister case, I can tell you a lot about because I, lived it. But other than that, like, I don't know a lot about some of these bigger cases, which is probably interesting to some people, but I just don't know. That's actually one thing that I love about watching these documentaries like the Natalie Holloway case or the Lacey Peterson case is that I don't know a lot about going into them. So it's not like I have 20 years of media coverage of this going into this documentary, which I think gives me an interesting perspective, in all honesty, watching it. So a couple nights ago, I watched American Killer, the Lacey Peterson story. And I did my video about that yesterday. I thought the video was very, very interesting. Not only did they have her mother and her friends, but they also had Scott Peterson's sister, and they had his sister-in-law. His sister-in-law that finds no fault in anything that Scott Peterson has ever done her entire life. And actually, I was like looking online, and all these people are like, she's so in love with him. And they're like, why is she like ride so hard for you? You never see Scott Peterson's brother Joe in any of these things, right? Joe's never in it. But the sister-in-law, I mean, Janie, she is in it to win it, okay? I don't know if she was a fuck this dude. I don't know. I said yesterday in my video, I said, I am not sugarcoating shit anymore. I don't know. I'm going to tell you how I really see it when I watch it. I don't know what is going on, okay? But she like defends this man. I mean, it's like anything that they come up with is just baffling. So I took lots of notes, and I want to get into this, okay? So going into this, I just wanted I was watching it. I thought to myself, okay, how do I want to start this? So convince me otherwise, because I just watched the other documentary, and I'm 100% convinced that he's a convicted murderer, okay? We can speculate all we want, but he's a convicted murderer. Scott Peterson, okay? So convince me otherwise, And I'm looking at this with the evidence that we know to be true today, okay? Not speculating about white vans, brown vans, and all this other stuff, but we will get to that in just a second. But before we get into this, I want to talk about the fact that the reason these documentaries are kind of coming out right now is that I think it was in March of last year, but then it like became finalized in May, and then in July they approved it. The Innocence Project LA. Now, I said in my video yesterday, I just said the Innocence Project, and several people corrected me in my video and said that the Innocence Project and the LA Innocence Project, it's the LAIP, they're completely two different entities, which is 100% true. I was not aware of that, so I just want to say thank you for bringing that to my attention. I thought it was all part of one network, but that's not true. So, and apparently the Innocence Project is not happy that they are getting like umbrellaed into this whole situation. When I went and I looked, so the Innocence Project came out and they wanted DNA testing done on certain DNA, which we'll get to in a second, and evidence that was never entered into the court trial and things like that. They want that entered into evidence and things like that. The only thing that was granted was that duct tape that was found on Lacey Peterson's body will be DNA tested. That's the only thing that they've approved of. But when I was, watching all this, I was thinking to myself, like, so this could be a whole new court trial. This could be all this kind of stuff. I went in and I looked. The original cost minimized. Okay, this is like the minimum cost that it could have cost. The original Scott Peterson trial, not including the investigation, not the police time, not the volunteer time, all that kind of stuff, was estimated at $3.2 million. Okay, so if Scott Peterson is exonerated from this, if he had nothing to do with this, if the evidence comes out to prove that his DNA is not on Lacey Peterson's duct tape and this was somebody else, then I think that that's very, very important that we find out that Scott Peterson didn't have anything to do with this, right? But if this DNA testing, evidence testing does nothing, it doesn't prove anything, then not only is Scott Peterson a convicted murderer, okay, but he is also somebody that is wasted, because the taxpayers are the ones that are paying this money. He is also somebody that is so entitled, sitting there, never able to tell the truth about what really happened, hurting his family and hurting her family, and is causing the taxpayers a lot of money. It's actually a really huge issue when you look at it from a taxpayer money point of view, And I looked in there about how much of this the taxpayers had to pay, and the taxpayers, their estimate was $3.2 million from the original trial. That's a lot of money, right? So I think this opens a huge discussion on whether or not he is innocent or he's guilty in this. I mean, for me, he's guilty all day long. And I will tell you this documentary did him no favors, okay, whatsoever. This documentary angered me so much. But if the opposite is true, then I think that, can these people finally shut up? Can Janie finally shut up? Can all these legal analysts that they didn't have any legal analysts in this documentary, this face-to-face documentary, that gave any pertinent information. They were all on the side of Scott Peterson. This documentary was so biased. When you watch the Netflix documentary, American Murderer, it is so completely unbiased. They allow his family to speak. They allow all these people to speak, different people to speak. This one was so biased in favor of Scott Peterson from the get-go. The documentarian is like, I used to think he was guilty, but now I don't. And I'm like, girl, you're another one that wants to fuck Scott Peterson. Like, that's just the truth. Can we just look at this for what it really is? She didn't ask him every question she asked him was a leading question in the interviews. She didn't ask him any pertinent questions. I'm going to prove it to you right now. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say before getting into this, okay? But like I said, this documentary did him absolutely no favors whatsoever, right? This did him more harm than the Netflix one did, which was actually supposed to be in favor of Lacey Peterson, okay? This documentary, I feel like, did him more harm. The man should never, ever, ever be allowed to do an interview. Nobody should interview Scott Peterson because he incriminates himself and makes himself look like the world's biggest idiot in the entire world. Scott Peterson should never, ever, ever be in any interview. He proved that 22 years ago in the Diane Sawyer interview and the local access news station interviews, and he's doing it again in this documentary. He should never, ever open his mouth whatsoever, okay? So I'm going in here and I'm watching all this kind of stuff, and they're bringing all this stuff up, and I'm like, why didn't they bring up this stuff? I mean, he had one of the highest paid, best attorneys. They said it in the other documentary. He was like one of the top 3 attorneys, and they had a team of attorneys in the state of California that he hired, right? That had been on Larry King and all these things. Why weren't these things brought up in the original trial when in the original trial, I mean, this is factual. They talked about this in the other documentary. The prosecutors were inexperienced compared to this master attorney and his team of attorney legal analysts that were doing mock interviews with Scott Peterson and looking into every aspect of the trial. Why did they not bring up all this evidence at the time? Much of which they already had, which I looked into. I'm completely confused why they didn't bring this up at the time. But the theory that they have now, okay, is that Lacey Peterson supposedly witnessed a burglary that occurred across the street. Now, the date of the burglary, they say it was on the 26th or the 26th. There's so much that's so confusing to me about why anybody doesn't look at this factual evidence. So the burglars say that it happened on the 26th. Lacey Peterson went missing on the 24th. The family originally said that they came back on the 26th. And now they're saying that they came back on the 27th. So the family can't even get the story right. But nobody's going after the family. Everybody's going after the police because the police are the ones that apparently botched this job up. But nobody looked at this back in the day. Well, because the police or the judge would not allow the burglary to be entered into evidence because of the dates that it occurred on, right? Okay. So what they're saying is that Lacey Peterson witnessed this burglary, that several people in the neighborhood apparently witnessed the same burglary. When this one guy, he was interviewed in his living room saying he had seen Lacey Peterson walking down the street, and then later they showed an interview of him on the news, and they're like, oh, you saw the burglars in the front yard? He's like, yeah. I'm like, you see everything, and you live 2 streets away. How is that even possible? No wonder they didn't put you on the stand, okay? Oh, but they got all kinds of excuses for why they didn't put any of the eyewitnesses on the stand, right? So anyway, I'm watching this, and they're talking about how Lacey Peterson apparently witnessed this burglary. Actually, Scott Peterson says he believes Lacey Peterson went across the street in the middle of this burglary to find what was going on. An 8.5-month pregnant woman went across the street during a burglary to try to break it up, okay? That's Scott Peterson's defense. And that she witnessed it, they kidnapped her, and then they later murdered her because she witnessed this burglary. But the timing doesn't quite work for this whole scenario, but we'll get to that in just a second because they say one thing and then they contradict themselves. It's so interesting when you watch this documentary, right? So when you go in here, that's the theory that they have now, right? But this is my thing, and I said this in my video yesterday. I'm going to reiterate it again today. Scott Peterson at the time was having an affair on his wife that was 8.5 months pregnant, okay? Let's just say that he had no involvement whatsoever in this murder, whatsoever, okay? At the time of the murder and weeks after, he was continuing to talk to Amber Fry, his mistress, girlfriend, affair, sex partner, as he refers to her now. He's now minimized her as someone he was just having sex with. So anyway, but that continued to go on weeks afterwards, okay? If he had told his wife, like he supposedly said he did, and his wife was okay with the fact that he had an affair, she's an 8.5-month pregnant woman, and they were so excited that she was doing her hair and they were eating cereal on Christmas morning watching Martha Stewart. They were so happy and so in love after he had just told her that he was having an affair that he was continuing to have because he was talking to this woman every single day. Had he told her, okay, because I don't believe that he ever did, but we will never know because he took her voice away from her, okay? But had he told her, Laci Peterson might have been over at her mother's house or a friend's house that day instead of at home when these burglars supposedly attacked like he did. Either way, to me, by his actions, he is somewhat either the murderer or somewhat culpable in the murder and the dangers that happened to Laci Peterson, okay? By not informing her and by now wanting to look back on it and being like, we were so in love. No, you weren't. You were having an affair on Laci Peterson, okay? And he said it's offensive that people said that he didn't want to be a husband. What did you want to be? When people say that you don't want to be a husband or a father and you say that's offensive, okay? You're not being a husband when you're cheating on your wife and while she's missing, you're lying to your girlfriend saying you're in Paris and not even being honest with your girlfriend and telling her and then saying on the 9th when you bought the boat. I mean, it's just so crazy to me. And then these attorneys want to come out later and say that there's no circumstantial evidence. The fuck there's not. There's tons in here, right? I get so heated about this case. I just found out, just started looking into it recently, right? So anyway, that's the theory, is that these burglars, that she interrupted this burglary and she saw it. There were other people in the street. This is the one thing that they don't talk about, right? Is that at the time that this happened, there were other people in the street. The neighbor next door that saw the dog. There were other people that were eyewitnesses of her. Why, if they were going to kidnap Laci Peterson because Laci Peterson was an eyewitness to the burglary, okay? Then all the eyewitnesses that also saw Laci Peterson on the street, like this one guy that they interview over and over and over again, that also saw the burglars in the front yard, and they were walking on the street, not driving on the street, why would they not have kidnapped those people too? Because those people had also witnessed a burglary, right? Okay, so that makes no sense whatsoever from a logical point of view. The detectives at the time, okay, so anyway, I will say this, that the family of Laci Peterson has chosen not to be in this documentary, nor did many of the prosecutors or anyone. Nobody wanted to be in this documentary because it was a bullshit documentary. So the only evidence that they show of the mother of Laci Peterson are these Today Show interviews that are all really pretty much in favor of Scott Peterson. So at the time, the detective said that when Laci Peterson went missing, that he had no panic, that he was very, very calm. And that's because he knew where she was. He knew that she was floating in the pond over there, right? And he was making excuses for what the detectives would find. So he would find these things, and then they would find these things, and then he would make excuses for it. Why? And then this is what's interesting to me is like all these people that are wanting to say all this stuff about Scott Peterson. Scott Peterson lied repeatedly over and over and over and over again to police, to neighbors, to family members, okay? To Diane Sawyer on an international interview. He lied to Diane Sawyer on an interview, on an international publicized interview. He lied to her and said he took a polygraph test when he never took a polygraph test. You know, on and on and on. So all these things that he lied. So why are we so interested in what Scott Peterson has to say now when he was lying back then? Why should we believe him now? He lied all these years later, you know? And it's interesting to me that today he uses the word sex. He reduces the relationship that he had with Amber Frey to a sexual relationship. He even says that she made more out of it after the fact. Well, Scott, actually, everything that we know about your relationship with Amber Frey is from the tapes. It's from your own voice saying that you wanted to spend the rest of your life with her, that you could take care of her for the rest of your life. Those are not words that are indicative, I want to fuck you. Those are words that are indicative of a romantic relationship out of your own mouth. So if anybody is to believe that it was a romantic relationship, that's entirely because you are the one that made people believe that. That's the truth, Scott. Sorry, okay? Then he said something about, like, she asks him, this documentarian that's just so biased, it's ridiculous. She says, did you think that they were already looking at you? And what's interesting to me about this is about 5 minutes before, in her own documentary, she interviews a detective, and the detective actually says that the first thing that he has to do is that he has to clear the husband. That in any case like this, the first thing that you have to do is to clear the husband. But the documentarian leads the interview so much in the favor of Scott Peterson that she makes it look like the police aren't doing their job to pander to the rest of the narrative of the sister-in-law that they aren't doing their job because they're looking at Scott Peterson, when actually that's really, really normal that they would do this, right? Okay, then he goes into this interview and he talks about how, well, she was eating a bowl of cereal and she was doing her hair on the 24th and we were all so happy, and he goes, and those things are still with me today. And I'm like, wait, was that while you were fucking Amber and that you were saying that you could take care of her for the rest of your life, that those memories of you with Laci Peterson eating cereal and doing her hair on the morning that you killed her, were those the same? I'm confused, okay? Because then after you killed her, you called Amber Frey and were trying to hook up with her to fuck her. So can somebody please explain this to me? I mean, this guy, it just baffles the mind, right? Then it talks about how he made the decision to go fishing, but he got the license for the 23rd and the 24th, but he said he made a decision to go on that morning. So on Christmas Eve morning, now I don't know about your Christmas Eve, but my Christmas Eve is like last minute shopping, wrapping presents, getting ready for Christmas Eve dinner, spending time with the family. You drive 90 minutes when there are many different places that you could go fishing nearby. You drive 90 minutes to go out in the middle of nowhere with your new boat and the license that you said that you got the license, that you could go fishing anytime, but you decide Christmas morning when you got the license from the 23rd and the 24th. That's evidence, okay? When all these people want to speculate about all this kind of stuff, that's evidence, okay? You got the license for the 23rd and the 24th. That's the truth, okay? And all these people want to speculate about this. They say there's no circumstantial evidence. There's a piece of circumstantial evidence. He didn't tell anybody he bought the boat. He told Amber Fry on the 9th when he bought the boat that he had lost his wife. And this would be his first Christmas without his wife. When Amber Fry confronts him about it, he says there's many ways that you can lose a wife. And she goes, yeah, but you knew that your wife was missing. He goes, I can't explain this to you right now. People want to say that there's no, all these analysts want to say there's no circumstantial evidence in this documentary. These are all evidences of circumstantial evidence, right? Then it goes on, he talks about how, like, he leaves a sweet message to Lacey after he leaves fishing and blah, blah, blah. He says that he has, he says that these people that are coming for him over the message that he left for Lacey Peterson, when he was, like, driving home, he's like, hey, babe, blah, 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 whatever. He says the people that are, like, challenging that are people that have really, really sad marriages. These detectives have sad marriages. I feel sorry for them. You were having a long-term affair of over 2 months with a girl that you met through another friend at a conference when you had a name tag on at a conference with your pregnant wife that said horny bastard on it, okay? Who's the one with the sad marriage, Scott Peterson? You can't even 22 years later say, yeah, I didn't want to be with her. And I was having an affair with somebody else because I didn't want to be with my wife anymore, but I didn't kill her. Okay, at least that would be honest. But you can't even say that. You want to paint a picture of a rosy marriage when you were at a conference before you met Amber Fry with a name tag on that said horny bastard. You know who included that? That wasn't in the Netflix series that was defending Lacey Peterson. That was in your documentarian's documentary, the one that I watched last night that's supposed to defend you. I didn't know about that, okay? They included that in the documentary that was supposed to defend you. So explain to me why a husband with a 6.5-month at the time pregnant wife is at a conference with a name tag that says horny bastard. That's some bullshit right there. People want to talk about circumstantial evidence. Okay. Then it goes on and it says that, like when he comes home, I talked about this already, they eats pizza, he takes a shower, puts the mop bucket, all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, you know, this is so interesting to me. And he's like, what? There's nothing, what's abnormal about that? Like my husband, if I don't start answering texts at a certain time during the day, he'll like call a friend or my neighbor and have them check on me. Like, I don't think it's abnormal that somebody would be worried about your spouse, especially when they're missing on Christmas Eve and you don't know that they're home, like in the car. I mean, it's like baffling to me, right? I mean, he's just like, oh, I thought she was at a friend's house for mom's or something, so I thought I'd take a shower, wash my bloody clothes from killing her, and then eat a piece of pizza. I mean, this really shows how, like, sociopathic he is, that he really could care less about what he had just done. If it comes out, I mean, like, there's no evidence to his DNA, and we know for factual evidence it's got, we already know, right? But that's how he felt after he killed his wife, right? It's crazy to me. Then he says on here, you have no idea how many times I was on the edge. And I'm like, he says during the missing period, like how many times he was on the edge. You were on the edge while you were lying to Amber, acting like you were in Paris looking at the Eiffel Tower on New Year's Eve. Girl, that's when you were on the edge? I'm confused about that. Can somebody explain that to me? Okay, then they go in and all the time that you wouldn't cooperate with the detectives, you wouldn't let them come in on it. They had to serve you a search warrant. You wouldn't let them just search the house. We'll get to that in just a second. But you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't cooperate with the detectives whatsoever. You didn't even, like, most of the time that people were out putting flyers up, you wouldn't even put flyers up, right? In fact, there was a box of flyers that were found with you when you were arrested that you were supposed to have posted about your missing wife. You know? And yet, Judy and Tom Smith down the street that didn't even fucking know your wife, they're out there looking for her, and you can't be bothered. Now, you're in there texting Amber Fry about the next time you want to fuck her, right? Okay. So anyway, they go on this whole thing about finding the dog at 10:18 and the neighbor and all this kind of stuff. Then the sister-in-law shows all these missing posters, and she's like, we still have all these missing posters. I'm like, oh, are those the missing posters that Scott was supposed to post, but he didn't post those? Anyway. Then they go in, and the sister starts talking about, and all these legal analysts start talking about how Scott was the one that was being focused on, okay? And so they leave with this whole narrative that the police were not doing their job because they were solely focused on Scott Peterson. The detectives actually explain this, and the only consistent stories between both documentaries are the detectives. The detectives tell like the exact same story in both documentaries. Everybody else, it's completely different, right? So when I'm watching this, it's interesting because Google's pretty easy to use, but apparently this documentarian, she doesn't know how to Google, because I Googled, and in 2021, 34% of all women that were killed by their intimate partners, which is the reason why when women are killed or they are missing, the first person they look at is their intimate partner, which the detectives explained. The first person they had to clear was Scott Peterson. Scott Peterson was not cooperative with the police, okay? That he didn't even want them to come inside their home without a search warrant. That's the reason why Scott was being looked at. Had he given them open access to it, they probably wouldn't have been focused on him so much. So he's the one that fucked up his own case, denies the search warrant, you know? Then Amber Frey comes forward, and this is the thing about the search warrant I want to say right now that I was like watching last night. The detective said this in both interviews, that he said to her, he said to Scott, we don't know, like she may have had another boyfriend. We need to look at your computers and your phones. I'm thinking to myself, when he said that, the detective said she may have had another boyfriend. He's thinking, if they find my phone, they're going to find out that I'm talking to Amber Frey, okay, if they search our house. And that's why he denied the search warrant, because he was worried that the police were going to find out about Amber Frey. And he had to string Amber Frey along as long as he possibly could. But then she comes forward, right? Amber Frey comes forward, and then she allows the police to tape her phone calls. Not just a few phone calls. And when you talk about circumstantial evidence, when these people are like, there's no circumstantial evidence, the detective quotes in the defensive documentary, Face to Face, 29 hours of wiretape. 29 hours. This one woman says he's lying about things he doesn't even need to lie about because that's how pathological he is. That's what one of the women in there is supposed to do. So then he buys the boat. He looks at the tides. It all looks premeditated. All these detectives in there are saying that, right? And then he says later in the interview, he says he cheated because he was selfish and lonely because he wasn't at home. And so when he wasn't at home, he missed Lacey so much that he had to cheat. Except for that he went to Christmas parties and he spent a lot of time texting and talking to Amber Frey on the phone. He actually went to a Christmas party on a time that they had another event that he chose not to go with Lacey. Instead, he chose to go to the Christmas party with Amber Frey. And then that's when he says it's offensive to say that he didn't want to be a husband or a father, right? I don't know. But he also didn't want Amber Frey to come out of the woodwork because he knew that it would screw him. Then he goes on to continue to focus on the sex aspect of this relationship with Amber to minimize the relationship and the conversations that he had with her otherwise, right? He wasn't afraid that it would take attention. He says he's afraid that it would take attention off the search, that if Amber Frey came out, that it would take attention because it would all of a sudden, they would be so laser focused on Scott that they wouldn't be looking for Lacey anymore because they would just be looking at the case with Scott Peterson, right? Or maybe what it would do, it was actually, if Amber Frey came out, it would give you motive on why you killed your wife. So it wasn't that you wanted the search to stop, it was that you were afraid of the motive coming out. I think that's what it is, right? Then it goes in to talk about all these people that the investigator finds and that saw Lacey with her dog. And I'm like, why wasn't any of this brought up in trial? Now, they address this later, okay? And they say that the reason why they didn't bring it up in trial, the one woman that worked on the team, she says the reason why they didn't bring it up in trial is because the prosecutors, okay, the third best attorney in California with a team of attorneys cannot stand up to these inexperienced prosecutors. They are so afraid to put up numerous eyewitnesses that saw Lacey Peterson walking her dog, okay? That could verify she was alive after the time that this woman said that her dog was in the yard. They don't put any of them in the stand because they're afraid that they'll say that they have a weak case, okay? I ain't buying it at all. This attorney doesn't put any of those people in the stand. When the jurors even come out, when they're interviewed, 3 jurors come out and said, had they put any of those eyewitnesses on the stand, it would have completely changed the case for us. This camera's going to stop. Hold on a second. So even the jurors are telling you that had they put the eyewitnesses on the stand, it might have been a completely different outcome for Scott Peterson. But they chose not to do that, right? Then he goes on and they talk about the burglary, okay? And the burglary was across the street. And it was the 24th. It could have happened anywhere between the 24th and the 26th. And that the people left at 10:30, okay? So they're speculating that it happened right after that. So the people left, and right afterward, a van, like the Scooby-Doo mystery van, 5 people show up and rob this house literally minutes after the people left. So they were scoping out this house, so they knew these people were leaving. They came the minute they never thought maybe these people might come right back around, because it would have had to have happened right after they left, right? And even the burglars in the other documentary, which she doesn't mention anything about in this documentary, say that they saw all the media on the street when they were burglarizing the house, right? And I'm not going to get into all the facts because I talked about that in the last one. So then Scott Peterson says that the police, that he got an apathetic response from the police department. And I'm like, actually, their response wasn't apathetic at all. They were looking for your wife. You were standing in the way of them looking for your wife. And actually, if anybody had an apathetic response, it was you, Scott Peterson, not the police, right? Then it goes on to his sister-in-law again, and she's talking about how she was so worried about Lacey's body, and when she heard that the baby had washed up on the shore, and then she knew it was Lacey. They show this, and then they flash this interview with Scott Peterson about the body being found, and the woman's like, were you worried that it was Lacey? And he goes, I wasn't worried at all. It wasn't even a thought to me. He was like, other bodies wash up on shore all the time. I'm like, okay, you're in the middle of your wife being missing. Your sister-in-law, who's been like on your side the whole time, she even thought in that moment, I mean, you're telling me that you lost your wife all this time ago, you had nothing to do with it, and they find a body and a baby, and you don't for 1 second think that that could possibly be your wife and your unborn child? I mean, give me a break, right? Then she asks him if he was flying to Mexico. He was like, no, I was just in San Diego. But she doesn't ask him about the stuff that was found in his car. She doesn't ask him any of that kind of stuff. In fact, his sister-in-law is the one that has to stand in and defend him, right? He talks about how he has brother's license because he wanted to play golf, and it was cheaper with his brother's license because he was a member, okay? Then that's why so he changed his hair and his goatee because he wanted to evade the media that were trying to like constantly get at him and people that were giving him death threats and stuff like that. He had his brother, who incidentally, the hair color and the goatee looked just like his brother. He had the ID of his brother to go golfing, but he had the ID so that he could not have to pay the expensive fines, right? Okay. And then he had already sold Lacey's truck because he knew she wasn't coming back. So he had already sold Lacey's truck. So the cash that he had in his car, which was $10,000, he was selling to his brother, okay, Joe, which is what his sister-in-law says. She says the reason why he had that cash was because he was selling the car to his brother. Well, he had $10,000 in cash. I looked up the price in 2003 of a 2002 Ford truck, which is what he had, and the selling price for that was $25,000 in 2003. So he was giving his brother a $15,000 discount on this truck. Or was he selling the truck to his brother because at that time the prosecution was trying to enter the truck into evidence because they thought that it had something to do with the murder of Lacey Peterson? Could that be why you were trying to get rid of the truck? And it's really not, you were just selling it to your brother? Why were you selling it to your brother? Were you selling it to your brother because maybe they wouldn't look at it? I mean, she doesn't go into any of this kind of stuff in there, right? And then it sounds that, he says in there that when he was found, he had a really terrible physical reaction to being told that his wife and his child were dead when they tell him that he's in the back of the car. And the detectives, both detectives say he literally had like one tear. And his sister goes, he had a tear. And I'm like, you are ridiculous, gal. I mean, you need to back up off Scott Peterson's dick for a second. And then she's like, that's the public perception, is that he had one tear and he went and ate a double-double at the In-N-Out. That's exactly what he did. That's not the public perception, it's the truth. The detectives put it in their they logged it in. That's exactly what he did. Then this criminal analyst and the team, they do this mock interview, and they decide that they're not going to put him on stand. Why? Because he does so horrible in these interviews. Because he's a narcissist and he's got all these issues, and they say this. I mean, these detectives are like, he's a narcissist, he's a sociopath, there's no way. I mean, even the lawyer that interviews him was like, I mean, I don't know why you wouldn't put him on stand, but I mean, like, after I interviewed him and I asked, he does a mock interview. He can't even give you a straight answer of why they wouldn't put him on stand. The only thing he says is, well, I mean, you saw the Diane Sawyer interview, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. Then it goes on, and this person says, character evidence case, and it says it's a character evidence case, and it's nothing else. And I'm like, there is a great deal of circumstantial evidence. And this person says there isn't any circumstantial evidence. And it's said by a legal analyst. And I'm like, what? I've now watched like 2 true crime documentaries from 2 different points of view. Okay, and I can see that there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. And then I took to the Google again, and it says on there that in 2020, 50% of the murders, because he says in there, you don't kill somebody without getting your hands dirty. Okay, well, in 2020, 50% of the murders were never caught. So that's absolutely 100% false from a legal analyst that she used in her video. All these people were hired to back Scott Peterson's story, okay? Then the juror comes out and he says the defense was very professional, but it was the prosecutors that were bumbling it, and goes on to talk about all that kind of stuff. So it was Scott Peterson's defense team that was so professional that they couldn't even win the case for him. I mean, it's just crazy to me, right? And then it goes on, and I'm like looking at this, and the detectives' accounts, like from both documentaries, are both completely consistent. The legal expert, Scott Peterson's side of the case, all of it is completely different, right? And then this woman goes, the Amber tapes showed a completely different side of him. You're right. They showed the side that he was trying to hide from everybody else, right? Then it goes into the why they didn't bring up the eyewitnesses. Then it goes on talking about the burglary not being able to be presented into court and all this kind of stuff. Then the legal analyst says that the prosecution said it's not a coincidence with all these things. Okay, so they closed the prosecution's case on the tide charts and all this kind of stuff, right? That calls to Amber Fry. And he's like, you can't look at all this stuff. It's like, there's no coincidence there, right? Which is interesting because the legal analyst uses this as an excuse. She's like, there's a lot of coincidences, a lot. But if you flash forward to the previous episode, the documentarian actually uses the word coincidence as a word against the detective leading the case, because he says in murder cases there are no coincidences. And she uses that against him, okay, when he comes out about the burglary. So now you use it against the detective to prove one point, but now you have your legal analyst using it. So your own documentary contradicts itself, period, in the story. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever, right? Then it goes on and it talks about the people being upset that the eyewitnesses weren't heard, but they're blaming the police. Like, all the people are blaming the police that the eyewitnesses weren't heard, when that was his attorney's choice, right? That was Scott Peterson and the attorney's choice. Then it goes in, they talk about the burglary theory and more people being involved. It wasn't just Lacey, or it wasn't just the 2 people, it was 5 people. And then she was trying to apprehend the burglary, and everybody keeps on saying there's nothing to tie him to the evidence. I'm like, I've watched 2 documentaries, 6 episodes of this now. There's tons to tie you to this case. Tons of it, right? And then the same person that saw Lacey Peterson was also that person that saw his van. I'm like, these are people that just want to get on the news, okay? Which is why they probably didn't put him on the stand to begin with. Then it goes on, and it's about, okay, this journalist goes in about this brown van, okay? The brown van that they're wanting to enter into evidence, because this brown van, here's how I have it written. The brown van that was borrowed by the guy that lived near the friend of the cousin of the sister of the man who lived next to where the van was burned, but we don't know if that was the van, okay? That's literally how he tells it. He finds it in some, and the van has no link whatsoever to Lacey Peterson, whatsoever, okay? And so, I mean, Scott Peterson's not worried about some body floating in the pond where he was fishing that day, or the bay, and he says, oh, bodies show up there all the time. But you want to go look at some van that has literally no tie to the case whatsoever? Because every other van that they said was a white van, not a brown van. So why are we looking at a brown van? Then he goes on here, and this other person, this arson investigator, goes on to talk about how there was human blood on the mattress. And I'm sitting here, and I'm like, and then they talk about how no blood was detected when it was tested. And I look up luminol, because they keep on going about these luminol tests. Luminol can often show a false positive if it's reacting to metals and iron. Well, you're talking about a burned van. How much metal and iron is in a burned van, right? So, I mean, and then they talk about human DNA being on a mattress. It's a mattress! People have slept on it. We have no idea if this is linked to Lacey Peterson. But they keep on bringing this brown van up as an excuse, right? Then they go into this mailman, and this mailman was there from 10:35 to 10:55. But the dog wasn't barking, which his sister-in-law says means if the dog wasn't barking, then Lacey Peterson was on a walk with the dog, okay? People saw a pregnant woman walking a dog. Scott left right before 10:18. So if Lacey is alive after 10:30, Lacey couldn't have encountered the burglary. Okay? But then how did she walk to the park where people saw her if she was also there for the burglars? Because the burglary supposedly happened right after that. So if she's at home witnessing the burglary, how is she also in the park where all these people are witnessing her walking? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You know? And then they go into these tips that they received and why the police never looked in these tips, okay? All the tips on there say they saw a white van between, not a brown van that we've already done a whole half an hour on, a white van. I read each one of them. You can go and watch the documentary. It says between 2 and 3 p.m. Then they interview this Tom guy, okay? And he says in his interview that it's a white van. And I'm like, why are we looking for a brown van? Why do we even bring the brown van into this at all? It has nothing to do with it, right? And at this point, it just feels like these people are just grasping for, straws completely. They're just doing anything to try to discredit the investigation. And then she says something, this one lawyer says something about material exonerating evidence. And I'm like, what? The brown brown van or the white van? You don't even know what color van you're looking for at this point. Then they go to this correction officer that gives this tip, and then he takes his tip back because it was just hearsay that he saw basically on the cell block. But they interview this whole guy, have him get dressed up. I mean, it is so grasping at straws, this documentary is ridiculous, right? Then they go into this whole thing about the watch, okay? And that Laci Peterson's supposed watch that she received from her grandmother was pawned at this pawn shop, okay? This is a big part of the documentary. They never go in to say if they ever proved it was Laci Peterson's watch. In fact, it was pawned like 2 weeks later by a woman in this pawn shop. In fact, they say on there, that they didn't know if it was Laci Peterson's watch or not. But why didn't the police look into it? And so they go into all this stuff about that this should have come up in the court trial. Well, I go back into looking for this court, and actually, on Thursday, 6/17/04, the defense attorney actually produced the pawn ticket in court. It was produced into evidence, the pawn ticket. And actually, the pawn shop owner was investigated. I looked it up. There's articles written about it. So I'm not really sure how you miss something like that in a documentary when I just have a Peter Watches TV channel, and I could find that evidence pretty easily, right? Then he told his neighbor that he had gone golfing, but then changed it to his fishing. He couldn't even remember his own story that morning, right? Then the attorney says the detectives, after 20 years, are still trying to hold to their case. I just watched both documentaries. The detectives were just defending their stances of the investigation that they did 20 years before. It's actually pretty normal in true crime documentaries for detectives to be interviewed about a case. What's not normal is all this bullshit that y'all wanted to pull into this case, okay? Then they talk about how the duct tape will be tested, and his attorney looked, I mean, this attorney that he has, this Paula woman or whatever from the LA Innocence Project, I mean, she's like shaking like, oh my God, and she's like so nervous in the courtroom. I'm like, I don't think that's who I'd be hiring after 22 years of sitting in prison to open up my case. I don't think I'd be hiring. And the judge is sitting behind there, she's like, denied, denied, denied. I'm like, they are never going to let this man out. They just aren't. And their sister-in-law is like, I mean, if the duct tape comes across, then yeah, you got a case. Okay, and we'll have to talk about that when that happens. But until then, you ain't sucking his dick, okay? And that's just the truth. It just ain't, okay? You're gonna have to keep on visiting by video. I don't know what to tell you, gal. Then the legal analyst said that the media cited he was guilty. And I'm like, no. He says this case never would have been, like they would never have convicted Scott Peterson. I'm like, I never really watched anything about this case, except, I mean, I knew what the case was about, but I never watched anything in the media until these two documentaries. And your documentary, the one defending Scott Peterson, is the one that convinced me that he was a murderer, okay? So I don't know about all that, but at the very end of it, he's trying to push out a tear stub out of his final interview, and he says at the end, he tries not to be too emotional in the day room. And I'm like, baby, Miss Scott Peterson, let me tell you something, okay? You were not emotional when your wife went missing. You weren't emotional when, during the searches. You weren't emotional when she was murdered. You could only squeeze out of your eyes, you could only squeeze one tear, and you could squeeze in two doubles into your mouth, all right? You weren't emotional when you were interviewed by Diane Sawyer and multiple other people. Why start now, okay? That's what I got to say about it. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. I love you guys, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.